For multiple decades, people have been championing The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time, a Nintendo 64 game released in 1998, as the greatest game of all time. It took the widely beloved Zelda franchise and transformed it from its 2D roots into one of the first open-world 3D games to ever exist. From its stellar dungeon designs and innovative controls to its never-before-seen storytelling, this game truly had it all. But nowadays, all these things we take for granted are basically considered the standard for modern game design. And despite its overwhelming success, The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, a Nintendo Switch game released in 2017, still sits 5 whole ranks below Ocarina of Time on Metacritic's list of the highest-ranked games of all time. I wanted to ask a simple question. Are the user reviews correct? Is Ocarina of Time not only better than Breath of the Wild, but also the greatest game ever released? And if those reviews are to be believed, what exactly does Ocarina of Time do better than Breath of the Wild? Hi, I'm Archaic Noise. If you're a normal person, you might be stopping yourself and asking me, wait, Breath of the Wild is a game that came out on the Nintendo Switch, and Ocarina of Time came out on the Nintendo 64, a console that existed 10 years before the average age of the children watching this video. And you're absolutely right, which is why I wanted to ask this question. Is it possible for a game that old to be any better than a game so much more advanced? Maybe it's not possible in the aggregate or the general sense, but what if it's possible in some respects? What if there are categories where it actually outshines the competition? And hey, I've played both of these games extensively. I've put hundreds of hours into both of them. I've played Ocarina 10 times, and I've played Breath of the Wild at least 3 times, and I completed all the shrines in at least one playthrough. I'm more than qualified to make a statement about their overall quality, but in case you're not convinced, I was also a narrative designer in games development for 5 years, so I feel confident in talking about game production, game development, game narrative, game writing, and gameplay. You can rest assured that I will do everything in my power to give a fair, mostly impartial analysis of what each game does and how the player interacts with those systems. We're going to break down exactly what Ocarina and Breath of the Wild do in the following categories, in order. Controls, items and character abilities, puzzles, dungeon design, combat, boss and mini-boss design, quests, minigames, written dialogue, overarching plot, open world versus linearity, and finally, regional analysis. This is the table of contents. The video is also time-stamped. Watch at your leisure. Now, without further ado, is The Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time a better game than The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild? Controls. Now, obviously, because we're talking about the Nintendo 64, we're also going to be talking about the Nintendo 64's control scheme, and not any of the updated control schemes or controllers that got used in the 5 different re-releases of the game. Here's a list of the base controls Link possesses in Ocarina of Time. Movement. Use the control stick to move in all directions. This is, for all intents and purposes, omnidirectional. You can move forwards and backwards, side to side, spin in a circle, what have you. The control stick has 8 grooves in the original N64 controller, but the actual control stick itself has 360 degrees of motion, so you have the full range of movement available to you when moving Link around. Rolling. While moving in a direction, press the A button to perform a somersault in the direction you're moving. Jumping. When moving in a direction off a cliff, fully holding the control stick will allow you to leap from whatever you're standing on. Pressing A next to objects after you stand next to them also activates the jump command, which allows you to leap to a ledge above you. Z targeting. When you hold Z, the camera focuses on whatever's in front of you or centers behind Link. If Navi, your fairy companion, is currently hovering over an item, NPC, or monster, you'll Z-target that object and your camera will focus on it. This allows you to interact with distant NPCs and talk to them by pressing A. Z-targeting also allows the player to strafe, and while Z-targeting, the player gains the ability to side hop and backflip by holding left, right, or down, respectively, and pressing the A button. Attack with the sword. Pressing the B button swings your sword, and depending on what direction is held, forward or none, you perform a thrust or a horizontal slash, respectively. Z-targeting an enemy allows you to unlock the jump attack, where you press A and leap forward with your sword at the target. Z-targeting and pressing B also performs a vertical instead of a horizontal slash. Holding B down and releasing it after a moment allows you to perform a spin attack. Spinning the control stick in a quick circle and pressing B performs a weaker, immediate spin attack. Holding down the R button and pressing B allows you to crouch stab. Raise your shield. Pressing the R button allows you to block with your shield. This can be used while strafing during a Z target. First person view. When pressing the C up button on the N64 controller, you enter first person mode and can look around with the control stick, but you can't do anything else. This allows you to point your camera at distant objects that might not normally be visible on screen. Occasionally, Navi will have a bit of advice relating to the story situation that tells the player where to go. This feature overrides the first-person view until Navi has been spoken to. Use items. In the menu screen, you can hover over items and press one of the 3 lower C buttons, left, right, and down, to assign items to them. Outside of the menu screen, pressing the related C button uses that item. Using the bow, boomerang, slingshot, and hookshot enters first-person mode, in which you can move the camera and aim. Many items that can be put in bottles or obtained for quest purposes can be shown or given to NPCs, which requires entering a conversation or Z-targeting them and pressing the C button when prompted. The menu screen. Collected items that can be used are placed in the Items subscreen, which comes up when you press the Start button. You can switch between the Equipment subscreen, where Link's swords, shields, tunics, boots, and associated permanent upgrades, strength, diving, bomb bags, and quivers, are listed. There's also a Quest Status tab where songs, skulltulas, and heart pieces are tracked, in addition to spiritual stones and spirit medallions. There's also a world map and dungeon map screen, which get filled out as you explore the world. Now, here's a list of all the basic controls in Breath of the Wild. Movement. Moving the left control stick allows you to move in 360 degrees, just like in Ocarina. Link's movement speed determines how much noise he makes, and holding the control stick fully or partially forward changes his speed. Link also has the ability to run, but he can only run for as long as his stamina meter has energy, which replenishes so long as he moves normally. Climbing. Link has the ability to latch onto any surface he runs into or jumps on. The stamina meter determines how long you can stay attached to the wall, and only decreases when you move. You can press the A button while holding left, right, or up to jump in that direction, and you can hold down to jump in the opposite direction of the surface. Crouching. Pressing the L button toggles your crouch, which allows you to move more slowly and quietly. Camera control. The right stick allows Link to move the camera in a 360-degree arc around himself. Pressing the right stick also allows you to enter first-person mode, where you can zoom in and out to look at distant objects. Targeting. Just like with Z-targeting, the ZL button allows you to focus on an enemy or object. All associated controls that existed with Ocarina exist here. Strafing, backflipping, moving around while targeting, and interacting with specific NPCs are also featured in Breath of the Wild. Jumping. There's now a dedicated jump button, which allows you to perform short hops and the associated jump actions that existed in Ocarina, including strafing, backflipping, and jump attacking. Interacting. The A button has a lot more general use options for interacting with objects, mostly for picking up items scattered around the wild. The B button gets used to put away whatever object is currently being held. Attack with an equipped weapon. Whatever weapon is equipped is used with the Y button. Jump attacks and spin attacks make a return. Raise your shield. Press the R button to use whatever shield is active. Quick equip. Holding down one of the 3 directions on the control pad, left, up, and right, allows you to quick equip different rune powers, weapons, and bows without entering the main menu. The menu screen. Pressing the plus button allows the player to enter the menu screen to equip weapons, bows, ammunition, and clothing in the inventory tab. You can also consume food while the game is paused, allowing you to recover in the middle of combat. Some permanent upgrades, like the spirit abilities, get put in the key items list. There's also an adventure log, which provides quest descriptions, and an encyclopedia where you can review pictures you've taken of items and enemies, as well as a system tab where you can review controls, save and load the game, return to the title screen, or change certain in-game options. This is the most rudimentary, basic rundown of the controls that Link has in both games. With the obvious exception of swords, shields, and items, almost everything listed is available from the very beginning of the game. Your ability to move around, control the camera, and target things in the world is a basic feature of the control scheme in both games, and it hasn't really evolved all that much in the 20 years of game development that existed between the 2 releases. Normally when we compare the control schemes between 2 games that are this far apart, there's some fundamental difference or change that's made things staggeringly different. But in reality, the only big differences are jumping and item use with NPCs. Having a dedicated jump button makes it possible to jump when you want to, and most NPCs just automatically know whether or not you have an item in your inventory instead of needing to be shown the item directly. Okay, boring stuff is out of the way. Now here comes the fun analysis. Where Zelda has significantly changed is not in its basic controls, but in its items and character abilities. Items and character abilities. So the point of this section is to break down what items and character abilities are. Basically, anything granted to Link by virtue of the game giving him an item is a character ability. When he picks up the slingshot, he's now able to fire seeds, and when he picks up a bomb, he's able to blow up walls. To keep this simple, we're not going to compare the total number of things you can do through the controls, instead focusing exclusively on the abilities granted to Link by items he collects during his quest. Now, I am of the personal opinion that items and character abilities are the same thing. Functionally speaking, there is no fundamental difference between having access to magnesis and having access to the hookshot. Both of them have prescribed times they can be used, allow the player to interact with specific objects, and have puzzles designed around their usage to block access to progress based on the ingenuity of the person playing the game. They can both be used in or out of combat, they are both locked behind a certain amount of story progress, and qualify as rewards for advancing through the plot of the game. Finally, they both have specific parts of the controller associated with their use, which is defined against other things the player can do with Link. Here's a list of unique items found in Ocarina of Time. Deku Sticks, Deku Nuts, Bombs, Bomb Chews, the Slingshot, the Boomerang, the Bow, the Ocarina, the Hookshot, the Lens of Truth, the Megaton Hammer, the Magic Beans, the 3 magic spells, the 3 magic arrows, the 4 bottles along with 12 possible bottled items, 8 masks, you can hold one at a time, the Kokiri Sword, the Master Sword, the Begoron Sword, the Deku Shield, the Hylian Shield, the Mirror Shield, the Kokiri Tunic, the Goron Tunic, the Zora Tunic, the Iron Boots, the Hover Boots, 2 seed upgrades, 2 quiver upgrades, 2 bomb bag upgrades, 1 wallet upgrade, the Goron's bracelet, silver gauntlets, golden gauntlets, and the silver and golden scales for a total of 53 items, not including quest items or items in the trade sequence used throughout the course of a normal playthrough. For starters, in Breath of the Wild, there are 120 weapons, 30 different bows, 6 ammo types, 31 shields, 56 food items, 15 plants, 17 critters, insects and lizards, 8 minerals, 50 monster parts, 12 elixirs, 121 cooked dishes, 47 helmets, 31 pieces of body armor, 29 leg armor, and all associated abilities for the character, including 2 types of remote bombs, cryonis, magnesis, stasis, camera app, master cycle in the DLC, and the 4 story abilities, Rivali's Gale, Mipha's Grace, Daruk's Protection, and Urbosa's Fury, which can each be upgraded once. Finally, there's also the most important item in the game, the Paraglider, which is itself one half of the Deku Leaf from The Legend of Zelda: Wind Waker, for a whopping total of 586 different items in the game. Okay, so Breath of the Wild has almost 12 times as many items as Ocarina. What does this actually mean? Well, for starters, the cooking and ingredients system means that instead of relying on red potion or Lon Lon milk, you can just find ingredients out in the wild and craft your own red potions on the fly. Having a few apples, Hyrule herbs, Hylian mushrooms, and acorns in your inventory allows you to drop a bunch of them in tandem into a cooking pot and experiment to bring out the full effects of the items. In addition, if looking for a cooking pot is too much work, you can just strike up a fire basically anywhere you want and throw the items on the ground, and as long as they're set on fire, they'll turn into cooked or seared versions of the original objects, which heals for more hearts than they would normally. This is deeply more complex and innovative than anything Ocarina attempted with its inventory system. Which makes sense. 20 years of game development goes a long way. In addition, while there is a durability mechanic that limits overall usage of weaponry, there are now functionally different kinds of weapons that do different things and have different properties. There are wands that throw magical fire in addition to boomerangs. There are single-handed and two-handed weapons. Weapons themselves can be thrown to deal automatic critical damage at the expense of destroying the weapon. There are even multiple types of bows, some that zoom in when you shoot, some that shoot multiple arrows despite only costing 1 arrow per shot. There's even a bullet time mechanic that's built into using a bow in mid-air that allows for more precise aiming and critical hits. There are multiple types of shields that can all be used to shield surf down slopes at will, though it's a little tricky to figure out on a first playthrough. Finally, there are not only a very large variety of outfits in the game with a multitude of effects, but outfits themselves can be cosmetically altered at a dye shop and have their color changed using ingredients found in the wild. In the simplest terms, the sheer number of things you can do with the items in your inventory in Breath of the Wild almost outnumbers the number of things you can do with your items in your inventory in Ocarina of Time by 50%. If we add up all the different abilities Link has from all the items in his inventory in Ocarina of Time, we get about 30 different item abilities despite there being 53 items. Deku Sticks, Deku Nuts, Bombs and Bomb Chews, Slingshot and Bow. While both weapons use different ammo types, they have the same function for the purpose of activating switches. This counts as one item with 4 different total ammo types when including the 3 magic arrows. The Hookshot / Boomerang. While the Hookshot is technically an upgrade in that it allows Link to pull himself towards distant objects, they both have the same function, hitting distant switches or pulling those objects back towards Link. All 6 of the Ocarina's song functions activating NPC or story progress, revealing or hiding time blocks, changing the time of day, making it rain, warping Link to a destination, and calling Epona. The Lens of Truth, the Megaton Hammer, the 3 magic spells, the bottle, which for the purposes of this argument has only one function despite having 11 or so different items that can be placed inside, strength upgrades, diving upgrades, the iron hover boots, the magic meter, which grants access to the magic spells, magic arrows, and magical spin attack, the sword, though there are 3 different swords, they all function exactly the same, 2 of the 3 shields. The first 2 shields function roughly the same, while the mirror shield can be used for puzzles. While there are some complicated mechanics, like for example, needing to collect spring water with a bottle before you plant magic beans, then use the magic beans on a plot of soil, then use the spring water on the magic beans, then travel forward in time, I don't consider this to be a character ability any more than I consider using the contents of a bottle to be one. For all intents and purposes, despite there being 11 or so different items you can put in a bottle, I don't consider each one of them to be a unique character ability. Likewise, I don't consider taking a mask on and off to be a character ability because it doesn't empower Link to do anything, it just prompts an NPC to respond with some dialogue. Thus, in the best case scenario, there's about 30 different abilities. If we add up all the different abilities Link has from the items in his inventory in Breath of the Wild, we end up with 48, including the following. All 9 weapon types. Boomerangs, rods, spears, one-handed weapons, two-handed weapons, wooden weapons can act as torches, elemental weapons, Korok leaves, and the Master Sword. All 3 bow types and their 6 ammo types, normal bows, eagle-eye bows, and Lynel bows, which fire normal, fire, ice, shock, bomb, and ancient arrows. Shields, normal shields, Lynel shields can deal damage. Flurry rush, timed parrying, can only be done with a shield. Weapon throwing, bullet time, shield surfing, paragliding, sneak strike. All 6 associated item abilities, including both remote bomb types, Cryonis, Magnesis, Stasis, and the camera. 4 of the 4 story quest rewards, Mipha's Grace, Rivali's Gale, Daruk's Protection, and Urbos's Fury, which can be activated on command though they have a long cooldown, using items directly from the inventory, healing, eating, starting a fire, flint, elemental weapons, fire arrows, cooking, which uses ingredients from the inventory, all 8 of the main active clothing upgrades. Actives include Zora Armor, which allows for swimming, the Radiant Armor, which allows for blending in with stall enemies, the Gerudo Clothes, which allow Link to pass as female, the Climbing Set, which allows for less slipping on climbing terrain, and all 4 Monster Masks, which also allow for blending in with enemies. In the simplest terms, the sheer number of things you can do with the items in your inventory in Breath of the Wild almost outnumbers the number of things you can do with items in your inventory in Ocarina of Time by 50%. But it's not just that there's more things you can do. Of the above abilities in Ocarina of Time, the only ones available after the tutorial area, which includes the first major dungeon and the Kokiri Forest, are Deku Sticks and Nuts, the Slingshot, the Kokiri Sword, the Deku Shield, and the Fairy Ocarina. The remaining 24 abilities are locked behind story progress and exploration, with as many as half of them locked on a per dungeon basis. Compare and contrast this with Breath of the Wild, where almost everything, save the 4 story quest rewards, is available in the world immediately after the tutorial. For the sake of argument, if we only include the things you're likely to have immediately after the tutorial itself, chances are good you'll have access to one-handed and two-handed weapons, spears, wooden weapons, Korok leaves, one of the 3 bow types and one of the ammunition types, shields, parrying with shields, weapon throwing, bullet time, shield surfing, paragliding, all 6 associated item abilities, sneak striking, fire starting and cooking, and item use from the inventory, for a total of 24 of the 48 abilities granted to you in the first 3 hours or so of gameplay. So not only does Breath of the Wild give you all these things much faster than Ocarina does, but it gives you more options to interact with the world and significantly more things to find that expand your toolset. Verdict: Breath of the Wild has nearly 12 times the number of unique items that Ocarina of Time has, and nearly 50% more unique abilities granted by those items. The sheer number of things you can do in Breath of the Wild is significantly greater than it is in Ocarina of Time, and more than half of those abilities are available after the tutorial, compared with Ocarina, in which the majority of the abilities you get are locked behind the game's story. Puzzles. Ocarina's puzzle design. Now that we've had time to talk about them, we need to understand how character abilities interact with puzzles. How many actual character abilities, not just items, does Link have in Ocarina? In reality, not many. Deku Sticks, the Slingshot and Bow, Bombs, the Boomerang and Hookshot, The Ocarina, the Lens of Truth, the Megaton Hammer, the Mirror Shield, and the Hover Boots are the only items in Link's inventory that get used for actual puzzles. The Iron Boots technically qualify, but there aren't really any specific puzzles in the game that necessitate their use outside of the Water Temple, and the Silver and Golden Gauntlets just involve you picking up some rocks that block progress instead of actually having any associated puzzles. Noting this, what exactly can we say about the puzzle design in Ocarina of Time? There are some interesting mechanics that probably don't get talked about all that much. I'm thinking in particular about the bottled blue fire from the Ice Cavern as Adult Link, which is used to break through the red ice blocks you find, or the exploding staircase into Dongo's Cavern, which has a big cinematic cutscene associated with it. There's the obvious mechanics like hunting the 4 Poes with the bow in the Forest Temple, the fire maze in the Fire Temple, the water level mechanics in the Water Temple, the burnable wooden walls that close in on you in the Shadow Temple, and the time travel split that requires the Spirit Temple to be completed as both child and adult. These are all unique and not really related to character abilities, but in the majority of dungeons throughout the game, which is the only place puzzles appear with a few notable circumstances, your actual routine will fall into one of the following. Light some torches, press some switches, clear the room of enemies, hit some targets, push some blocks, do some platforming, collect some items, silver rupees, or come back later with an item. It would be more interesting for us to talk about puzzle design in Master Quest, which is not only a more technically complicated game with all unique puzzle design, but also involves some really rowdy stuff in the game's engine, like cows in the stomach walls of Jabu Jabu actually being switches that activate the door, which is infuriating on a first playthrough, by the way. But that's not really here nor there. We're talking about Ocarina's puzzle design, which for all intents and purposes falls into one of the aforementioned puzzle categories without really straying much from the formula. That's not to say that there aren't interesting variations on the theme. In the Forest Temple, for example, instead of actually shooting a painting with a Poe hiding inside, hit some targets, you have to complete a block puzzle that slams down in front of you that's clearly a picture of the Poe you're looking for, push some blocks. But this time there's a timer. Can you complete it within the time limit? The answer is yes, that's not very difficult at all. Maybe we can look at the Fire Temple, where you've pressed a switch to deactivate the fire shield around the chest at the top of the circular stairs. Press some switches, but there's a countdown clock playing in the background. Can you run up there in time without falling into the center? It's actually really easy to leap into the center pit if you're not paying attention. Or maybe we can look at the Water Temple, where a central pillar of water rises and falls based on when you hit a crystal, hit some targets. But for a limited time, can you ride it to the top in time? I'm sensing a theme here. In reality, most of the puzzles in this game don't break this mold because the actual range of objects they could place in the game world was limited, and the overall mechanics used to allow Link to interact with them were equally as limited. And that's not even to say you can't find slightly more complicated mechanics that get used for one-off purposes. The Water Temple's changing water levels and the Spirit Temple's changing time periods completely change what puzzles are available for you to complete, and felt like very innovative mechanics that broke up some of the monotony. But the overall structure of the puzzles remains almost squarely inside those boxes without really breaking into newer territory. Breath of the Wild's puzzle design. What about in Breath of the Wild? Well, in addition to the different types of puzzles that were present in dungeons in Ocarina of Time, lighting torches, manipulating blocks, pressing switches, clearing enemies, hitting targets, and collecting keys, there are also all new mechanics introduced in most of the shrines of the game. The main 6, the paraglider, 2 different types of bombs, Cryonis, Magnesis, and Stasis, get used for lots of functional puzzles throughout the game, but there are also multiple mechanics per ability that get used to functionally pass through these puzzles. I'm going to try to list all the additional puzzle mechanics here. Spherical remote bombs can be used in bomb tunnels to catapult an object across a large gap. After placing the bomb in the tunnel, wait for it to roll adjacent to the object that's being launched, and then activate the bomb to launch the object. Square remote bombs can be used to create a stationary object that won't roll around, allowing the player to create a time-sensitive trigger for a distance switch or object. This often gets used in conjunction with timed platforms that launch objects sitting on them into the air. Magnetic cubes that can be climbed on can also be stacked on top of each other with magnesis to create multi-tiered ladders. Rolling objects can be frozen with stasis, but some objects, like large rocks, can be paused with stasis and then hit multiple times, retaining all the momentum they gain from each hit. The object then catapults in the opposite direction of the last hit it took, which can in turn be used to destroy objects and obstacles in its path. Frozen pillars made with Cryonis can be used to block the flow of objects through water, and can also be climbed on, allowing the player to do things like make stairs on waterfalls. The paraglider mechanics can be used to descend from heights slowly, but can also be used in tandem with fans to reach high places, and can activate bullet time for the purpose of precise aiming for hitting switches or timing activations. In addition to all these mechanics, there are pressure switches that require dropping large numbers of objects on top of them, spherical switches that require a giant orb to be dropped in their slot to activate, lasers that can be placed on moving platforms to activate switches, conveyor belts that automatically move objects around, and even gyroscopic puzzles that rely on the Nintendo Switch's motion controls to roll balls through mazes. Based on a meta-analysis of all the shrines in Breath of the Wild, there are 66 unique shrine puzzles in the game, each with a unique puzzle inside the shrine designed specifically for that shrine. There are 5 apparatus puzzles that have a unique puzzle designed around motion controls, and 29 blessings that are granted to the player for completing a puzzle in the overworld. After accounting for the 20 tests of strength, which are a combat challenge instead of a puzzle, we arrive at roughly 100 different puzzles designed specifically for the player to overcome by thinking and completing a challenge using their character abilities. Shrines are very interesting to me because almost all of them have a level of complexity that goes above and beyond what we've seen in previous iterations of the Zelda series. Take for example the Ruko Mog Shrine, which has you rotating a cube with torches and a water spigot on one side that can douse the flame on the right side of the puzzle prematurely, making it difficult to figure out what order you're supposed to use to rotate the cube. You can easily brute force a puzzle like this, but it meets a criteria for complexity that Ocarina's puzzles are unable to meet. The Shayloya Shrine has you timing a shot on a ball that's being launched periodically in the air to activate a switch that then allows you to launch yourself into the air and use bullet time to hit a switch hiding in a crevice above. Even the less complicated shrines like this are completely unique puzzles that take advantage of the myriad puzzle mechanics that have been generated as part of the game's physics engine. For how the physics are designed in Ocarina, there wasn't really any concept of objects having airtime or altering the trajectory of objects in flight, or even forcibly sending objects from one location to another. Almost everything in Breath of the Wild's puzzles manages to be dynamic instead of static. The shrines that have puzzles inside all basically function as mini-dungeons. They are not actual dungeons, but they are filled with treasure and have puzzles in them, much like the Zelda dungeons of previous installments in the franchise, and each one gives a reward which allows the player to increase their stamina meter or total number of heart containers. More importantly, there are a variety of puzzles related specifically to unlocking shrines that may themselves only result in the player receiving a blessing, which is a chest reward for finishing a puzzle in the overworld. But that's not all. There is also a series of puzzles specifically designed for collecting Korok seeds, which can be used to expand the player's inventory. These puzzles are very diverse. Some of them involve placing a metal block in a stone structure to mimic a completed stone structure. Some of them involve timing challenges with moving bow targets. Some of them even include things you might not expect, like rolling a ball to the bottom of a hill and hoping it manages to land in the hole sitting at the bottom. That's golf, baby. There's a whopping total of 900 of these puzzles littered across the landscape of Hyrule. I'm just gonna admit, I don't really care about Korok seeds. But that sure as hell didn't stop me from reading through all 900 to classify all the different types of puzzles they designed. Move a conspicuous rock. Move an object sitting on the ground to make a Korok appear. Shooting targets. Balloons appear in the air when you find a pinwheel, and you have to hit them all with an arrow. Sometimes there's just a conspicuous acorn or apple, and one standout version of this is hitting and lighting a distant torch on a pillar. Fairy lights. Sometimes these move, sometimes they're static, but approach them and press A and a Korok gives you a seed. Fairy lights in the heights. Climb to the top of a very high location and there's usually a fairy light hanging around, like the top of Hyrule Castle or the tallest tree on Hebra Peak. Chase the flower. When you touch a little yellow flower, it suddenly jumps somewhere nearby. Follow it to its conclusion, and a Korok appears to give you a seed. Sometimes there are groups of flowers, numbered 1 through 5, that have to be collected in sequence. Matching game. 3 things will be non-identical, and you have to make them identical, like apples hanging from a tree. Offering. Place an item in front of a lone statue with a basket to give it an offering, usually an apple. Through the hoops. Jump through a flower ring by falling from a high place into a body of water below. I'm not sure what height restrictions actually exist on this. Throwing through the hoops. Drop a rock into a rock ring in the water to make a Korok appear. Hidden under rubble. Use stasis to hit an object away, or burn some leaves, or magnesis to move a door, then pick up the rock hiding beneath to find a Korok. Complete the picture. Use magnesis to move a metal block from one stone structure to another, making them both identical. Race to the finish. Step on a platform to activate a yellow circle somewhere in the distance, which has a circular countdown timer. Reach it before it disappears for a Korok seed. Complete the ring. Carry a rock from a nearby location to a circle of rocks and place it in the missing spot. Golf. Roll a boulder from a high place to a low place and land in the hole down below to make a Korok appear. This one's kinda luck-based, if I'm being honest. Ball and chain. Use magnesis to move a ball attached to a chain into a nearby hole and a Korok appears. Horse riding. There are exactly 2 Korok seeds received for jumping over fences in sequence on horseback. The numbers noted in the previous list are the total number of times you have to complete those puzzles to collect all the Korok seeds, and the top 3 spots are moving rocks, 175, shooting targets, 131, and clearing rubble, 109, and the bottom 3 spots are matching games, 22, ball and chain, 16, and horse riding, 2. The thing is, the game actually requires you to collect a little under half of all the Korok seeds in the game in order to max out your inventory space, because you can trade Korok seeds for inventory slot upgrades. I think in general, I complete a little over 100 in an average playthrough. I don't bother with the majority of these micro puzzles myself because I find them tedious, but for what it's worth, they are scattered all across the landscape of Hyrule. They're in every nook and cranny, hiding around every corner, literally under every suspicious rock, and obfuscated by every suspicious bush. Combined with the shrines and the puzzles that lead to their blessings, there's well over 1,000 puzzles outside of dungeons that afford a classic Zelda experience to the player. So there aren't just way more puzzles, there's way more types of puzzles, and they're scattered everywhere instead of being isolated specifically in dungeons. Does that mean Breath of the Wild is the master of all puzzles now and forever? Well, to answer that question, we need to talk about dungeons. That's right, dungeons. Dungeon design. Now what you could argue is that by hyper-focusing on these micro-puzzles and mini-dungeons, Breath of the Wild manages to fail in its puzzle design by refusing to elevate the puzzles in its primary 5 dungeons, the 4 Divine Beasts and Hyrule Castle, to the level of complexity and interconnectivity that's involved in the design of dungeons in Ocarina of Time. In the previous section, we dealt with the broad strokes, what the dungeons have inside them from a gameplay perspective, and now we're going to deal with the specifics on a game-by-game basis before explaining how each game stacks up. The dungeons in both games are meant to blend together the concepts you've been given across the scope of the time you've played. They allow you to make full use of the range of abilities that you've been granted by collecting items while providing a gameplay loop that empowers you to overcome obstacles. We're going to take a quick look at the puzzles in Ocarina of Time. How are the dungeons in Ocarina of Time designed? Let's start with a more obvious question. How many dungeons are there, what are they called, and where are they located? Dungeon 1, the Great Deku Tree, in the Kokiri Forest. Dungeon 2, Dodongo's Cavern, below Death Mountain. Dungeon 3, inside Jabu Jabu's belly, in Zora's Domain. Dungeon 4, the Forest Temple, in the Lost Woods. Dungeon 5, the Fire Temple, in the Death Mountain Crater. Dungeon 6, the Ice Cavern, in Zora's Domain. Dungeon 7, the Water Temple, below Lake Hylia. Dungeon 8, the Bottom of the Well, in Kakariko Village. Dungeon 9, the Shadow Temple, in the Kakariko Graveyard. Dungeon 10, the Gerudo Training Ground, in Gerudo Fortress. Dungeon 11, the Spirit Temple, past the Wasteland. And Dungeon 12, Ganon's Castle, in Hyrule Castletown. Let's start with the Great Deku Tree. The thing about the Great Deku Tree is that it showcases almost every puzzle in the game. They get a little more complicated, a little more convoluted as time goes on, but for the most part, every puzzle can be dropped into one of the categories of puzzle used in the very first dungeon. And I know what some people might end up saying, what about the Deku Brothers at the bottom of the tree? You have to hit them in a particular order. Surely that's a unique puzzle. I don't know how to tell you that it falls into one of the 2 categories, either hit targets or defeat all enemies. Just because you have to do it in a specific order doesn't mean it's not in one of those categories. And the first Deku Scrub you run into even tells you exactly how to do it, so you just go down and follow his instructions, and then the last Deku Scrub even tells you exactly how to beat Goma, the boss of the dungeon. To be honest, to call anything in this dungeon a puzzle, with the exception of breaking the web flooring in the first central chamber, would be giving it a lot of credit. None of these are really puzzles so much as obstacles. There's exactly one clear-cut way to do it, there's not really any thinking involved, you remove the roadblock and you keep going forward. Game design sensibilities were just different in 1998. They put a series of concepts in the first dungeon of the game to introduce you to all kinds of game mechanics so you can learn how to overcome the obstacles placed before you. Now, instead of giving a whole analysis of every dungeon room in Ocarina, because that would take forever, by my count there are 259 uses of puzzle mechanics inside of dungeons alone, from this point forward we'll talk about each unique one that's introduced. The two unique puzzles in Dodongo's Cavern are the Bombable Staircase, which has its own cutscene showing the staircase falling down, and the Bombable Eyes in the Dodongo statue in the main chamber. The two unique puzzles in Jabu Jabu are the uvula-like tentacles that fall from the ceiling that can only be defeated by the boomerang, and the very large wobbly blocks that can be stunned by the boomerang and used as platforms. The two unique puzzles in the Forest Temple are the twisted hallway that changes shape with the press of a switch, and the rotating chamber in the basement floor. The only unique puzzle in the Fire Temple is the Fire Wall Maze. The Ice Cavern is the first dungeon where large rotating scythes are featured, as well as the first dungeon where silver rupees are used to unlock something. The main unique gimmick of the Water Temple is its water level mechanics, which can be lowered to one of three heights in the main chamber and the main central tower. Invisible enemies and objects are introduced in the bottom of the well. The Scythe Hazard makes its second and third appearance here in the Shadow Temple, and giant fans that can blow Link off of objects appear for the first time in this dungeon. The only unique puzzle mechanic in the Spirit Temple is activating some kind of fire to burn Anubis creatures, which can be bypassed with a use of Din's Fire. When you take all of these puzzles together, you'll find that there are a good number of situations where they use multiple elements. When you collect silver rupees in Ganon's castle, you're required to use the hookshot to reach the rupees sitting just beneath hookshot targets on the ceiling. When you traverse invisible platforms in the Shadow Temple, you're required to use your Lens of Truth while equipping the hover boots to float across platforms. When you're on the moving circular dais in the Gerudo training ground, you're expected to land hits on the eyes of a center statue while in mid-movement. But the vast majority of the puzzles in the game don't actually combine more than two elements together, leading to the player progressing through the game at a steady clip. This by no means represents every puzzle in the game, but it does represent the majority of puzzles in every dungeon. Just to give a quick example, the Spirit Temple has about 23 rooms with puzzles, and by my count, 5 of them combine 3 puzzle mechanics, while 11 have 2 puzzle mechanics, and 7 of them use only 1 mechanic in each room. If we collectively include all the mechanics in the game that I've highlighted, we can conclude there are about 22 puzzle mechanics in this game, with about 1 or 2 bespoke puzzle mechanics introduced on a per dungeon basis. How are the dungeons in Breath of the Wild designed? There are 4 primary dungeons in the games, called Divine Beasts. Here's a breakdown of every puzzle in every Divine Beast. Vah Rudania. Pylon 1. The first pylon is above you, but it's perpendicular to the ground. Twist the interior to drop down directly in front of the pylon. Pylon 2. Burn the leaves above the metal doors that are blocking them from being opened, then use magnesis to open them and reveal a pylon. Pylon 3. Shoot a fire arrow through a narrow gap in the door to light a torch on the opposite side. Burn the leaves in the ceiling to drop a metal block down, then twist the interior. Pick up the metal block with magnesis to block the fire from the wall of fire spitters, then walk to the other side, twist the interior back, and activate the pylon. Pylon 4. Scale Rudania's back to find a pylon on the far side of the dungeon. Pylon 5. Grab the blue flame with a wooden weapon or torch. Twist the interior to allow you to walk all the way up and outside of Rudania and light a torch sitting on the left, which unlocks the grate in the long track. Twist the interior to send a ball down the long track, then twist it again to send it towards the entrance. Use magnesis to lift up the metal block at the end of the track, allowing the ball to drop down and slot into the ball holder below. Vah Ruta. Pylon 1. Use magnesis to turn the large wheel on the wall, lifting the pylon out of the water. Pylon 2. Use Cryonis to stop the water wheel at the right time by putting an ice block over the flow of water that causes it to turn. Pylon 3. Climb to the middle of the center water wheel, lift Ruta's trunk all the way up to send water through the ceiling, causing the wheel to turn. When the ball falls into its slot, the door to the pylon will open, but it will fall out unless you use stasis to hold it in place and keep the door switch active, allowing you to access the pylon. Pylon 4. By moving Ruta's trunk 1 or 2 pips away from maximum, you can change the center water wheel's direction forwards or backwards. Sending it forwards allows you to use the second, smaller wheel to scale the interior of the dungeon. After reaching the top, you can move Ruta's trunk all the way down, then all the way back up to access the pylon at the end. Pylon 5. Use magnesis at the metal wheel near the top of the dungeon to open the ceiling, send Ruta's water through the ceiling to douse the fire spitters below and access the pylon. Vah Naboris. Pylon 1. Rotate the backmost cylinder clockwise while entering from the outside to find and activate this pylon. Pylon 2. Rotate the frontmost cylinder until this pylon is horizontal with the ground. Pylon 3. Rotate the backmost cylinder to reach the upper outside area. Use magnesis to move the metal blocks into a configuration that completes an electric circuit, which lifts the tail into position when the backmost cylinder is rotated to a certain position. Rotate it again to lift and lower the tail as needed, using it to access the chamber above, which houses an elevator that leads to an electric ball you can use to activate a platform ahead. Take this platform to the next room, defeat some gloom, and activate this pylon. Pylon 4. Another elevator with another electric ball appears near the previous pylon. Use this ball to unlock a door that leads back to the other elevator, where you can grab the first ball to activate a 2-switch door on the lower floor, which houses this pylon. Pylon 5. On the exterior below the previous section, a wheel that you can spin clockwise and counterclockwise can be used to generate an electric current that activates Naboris' head. Use this to lift the head into position and ride the elevator to the top, where you can activate this pylon. Va Meadow. Pylon 1. Use a crystal in the middle room to change which windows are open, which creates a draft. Ride this draft over to reach this pylon. Pylon 2. Place a bomb inside the tunnel in the middle room and use Meadow's wings to roll the bomb down the track, allowing you to blow up the rocks in the way and release a large metal ball. Use Meadow's wings in the opposite direction to roll the ball back towards the window, then use magnesis to carry it to the track and use Meadow's wings to roll it towards the large switch on the opposite side, which unlocks the door. The pylon is above a ramp on the left side of the room. Pylon 3. Jump out the window and hover down to find a pylon in a small alcove. Pylon 4. Use Meadow's wings to send a small gondola down the track towards you, then enter the gondola and use the wings in the opposite direction to ride it across the gap. The pylon sits in the room above. Pylon 5. 2 fans that must be spun by air currents sit in a large chamber. When active, they unlock 2 gates on a separate track that are blocking a large object from hitting a large switch. In order to get them in the right spot, use Meadow's wings to roll them down a track, then hit a crystal to open the right windows to make the air currents activate them. Hold one of the fans in place with magnesis while using Meadow's wings in the opposite direction to send the object towards the switch, unlocking this pylon. Meta-analysis. Before we start on the meta-analysis, we do need to acknowledge the functional difference between the 2 forms of dungeons. In Breath of the Wild, the dungeons have evolved. They are no longer simply static zones that you explore off the beaten path, sitting hidden behind a series of obstacles. They are enormous, world-changing creatures that are affecting their environment. They have the capacity to terrify and endanger the local communities they're stomping around, and all 4 of the divine beasts are these gigantic constructs that you and your erstwhile companion have the power to wrangle and deactivate. A lot of people looked at this and said it was no big deal. A lot of people looked at this as the evolution of dungeon design and asked, why aren't they themed better? A lot of people looked at this and said the old ways were right. And granted, there's a critique to be made about them. It's not as if they're actually destroying whole cities or altering the landscape dynamically, because there's no time-sensitive quests associated with the beasts themselves. That's because to have those quests become time-sensitive would be antithetical to the purpose of the design of Breath of the Wild, which is that the developers stepped forward and said, hey, there's a real big world out there. It's the biggest Zelda game we've ever made, and it's packed full of stuff for you to do. So you know what? You start this dungeon when you're ready. And when a lot of people got into those dungeons, they went, well, this is really cool, but it's 5 puzzles and a boss. Why couldn't they have done more? The biggest factor in determining which dungeon design is better comes from understanding what they do from a gameplay perspective. While Ocarina's dungeons are aesthetically and tonally consistent with their own specific themes and manage to feel like a contained section of the adventure in their own right, the Divine Beasts in Breath of the Wild have an important active element that had never been tried in a Zelda game before. The Water Temple is basically the closest we got to having this feature. Changing the water level functionally changes the way you access the level, and is a requirement for accessing different parts of the level in sequence, allowing you to complete them based on how low or how high it is in the moment. But the problem with this is that there's a linear undercurrent to the level. At the start of the dungeon, there's only one place you can go, and it eventually leads you to the switch that lets you change the water level. Once you change it, you can only go to the immediate sections that have been unlocked in whichever level is accessible, which leads you back to the water switch, which in turn leads you to accessing one new area, and so on, until you hit that one roadblock everyone hits where they don't know about that one block that lifts up when you're in the central pillar that leads to the key you need to get. To put this simply for anyone who hasn't actually played it, the level is linear. You can't really do any of the puzzles in whatever order you want, and a lot of people get confused because of a single section of a single puzzle that's kind of easy to miss. I'm of the opinion that the reason most people dislike the Divine Beasts isn't because they're all aesthetically similar instead of being unique, bespoke designs, but because it's like doing the water temple 4 times. Think about it. Every time you come across a puzzle, you have to use the active component of the level, the Divine Beast gimmick in the map menu, to change a fundamental aspect of the level. You're moving around Vah Ruda's elephant trunk to add water to the central spoke wheel, or you're rotating the central cylinder in Vah Naboris to access a different part of the internal architecture. The functional difference between this and the water temple is that you no longer have to physically go to the switch to change the level, because now it's just in your menu and you can do it at your leisure. And at the end of the day, almost none of these Divine Beasts are challenging because you already have all the tools necessary to complete every puzzle. There's no item hidden inside that lets you gain access to a new puzzle set. There's no mid-bosses to break the dungeon into sections. There's just the primary 5 puzzles to unlock the final door and the boss itself, and you can pat yourself on the back for a job well done. The dungeons in Ocarina might all be linear, but they stretch the puzzles and your ability to access them out over a long enough period of time that they don't feel rushed. But in most circumstances, they don't feel tedious or overwhelming. Every dungeon has a good enough beginning, middle, and end that I think is mostly stymied by its linearity and overall lack of interesting puzzle mechanics. And that makes it really hard for me to say these dungeons are better, because from a gameplay perspective, they're really not. And this is where it gets really into the weeds, right? Because most of the mechanics featured in Ocarina are making near exclusive use of the fact that it was a game built in a 3D environment during a period of time when having a 3D environment was virtually new. The idea of using Zelda item mechanics to interact with that environment was groundbreaking stuff, so they developed a small handful of mechanics and then applied them to the majority of the puzzles throughout all the levels. They metered it out a bit, but if we're being totally honest, they introduce one new mechanic roughly once per level. Eye switches in the Deku Tree, bombable targets in Dodongo, stunnable targets in Jabu Jabu, hookshot and bow targets in the Forest Temple, heavy switches in the Fire Temple, blue fire and silver rupees in the Ice Cavern, sinking sections in the Water Temple, invisible objects in the bottom of the well, hover sections in the Shadow Temple, and sun switches in the Spirit Temple. They use a handful of these mechanics in the second half of the dungeon, and then incorporate them once or twice in future temples, if at all, and that's it. Hell, I'm pretty sure you use the Lens of Truth at least as often as the hover boots in the Shadow Temple, and significantly more times in the Spirit Temple. And here's where I think we need to have a conversation about the puzzles themselves now that we've broken down the dungeons. Calling the obstacles in Ocarina of Time puzzles is a bit of a stretch. I think that in order for you to call anything a puzzle, it needs to meet 2 criteria. 1, a puzzle in the majority of circumstances cannot be looked at and immediately solved, and 2, solving the puzzle requires properly executing whatever mechanics are associated with it. There really aren't very many mechanics in Ocarina that don't meet both qualifications, but they trip over the bar. The most immediate example I can think of is the second room with unlit torches in Ocarina of Time. You're given a closed door, some Deku Babas, and 2 unlit torches. You could maybe walk around and hit the Deku Babas, but when that doesn't unlock the door, you can immediately come to the conclusion that the door can only be unlocked by lighting the torches. Then you do it, and the door unlocks. This simplicity applies to the vast majority of puzzles in Ocarina, such that a lot of them can be distilled down to these base elements and understood without very much thought. To be honest, the most complicated puzzle in the game is probably either the sliding block puzzle in the Ice Cavern or the Silver Rupee collection in the Forest Medallion Room in Ganon's Castle, and this is because they meet both criteria very well. They are not immediately understood upon initial observation, and the execution of the mechanics can be easily fumbled. Part of the problem is that I can do this with every puzzle. The pillar with bomb flowers at the end of the Shadow Temple, the races to the finish in the Fire Temple, almost any use of silver rupees. Almost all of these puzzles behave significantly more like obstacles than they do like puzzles, because in the majority of circumstances, there's neither any complexity nor any execution-based problems that would arise, even for casual players. My immediate point of comparison would be the third pylon in Vah Rudania, where we not only have to use an unconventional mechanic, shooting an arrow through a narrow gap, but we also have to use a metal block to stop fire while using the dungeon gimmick to alter our perception of the puzzle and reach the pylon. There isn't a single puzzle in the entirety of Ocarina of Time that meets this level of complexity. To put this another way, think about a 10-piece jigsaw puzzle. You can look at it and solve it almost immediately because there's only 10 pieces, and there's only so many configurations it could possibly have. Any mistakes you make in completing the puzzle will be easily understood as mistakes and rectified within seconds. Now imagine a 100-piece jigsaw puzzle. It isn't just difficult to see how all the pieces line up, but there are often multiple configurations that look as if they're correct, meaning it's easy to make mistakes while assembling the final shape of the puzzle. Fortunately, video games reward you not based on how well you constructed your answer, but on whether or not you arrived at the correct one. And the thing is, only 11 of the 20 puzzles in the proper dungeons of Breath of the Wild have mechanics that meet both criteria in ways that are more advanced than Ocarina, while 5 of them are roughly the same level of complexity, and the remaining 4 aren't really puzzles. Almost all the examples I can use fall outside the scope and purview of the Divine Beasts and fall squarely inside the shrines. But I do feel the need to point out, the smallest dungeon in Ocarina of Time is the Bottom of the Well, which has about 6 puzzles in it, which is nearly half the number of puzzles that exist in the Shora Ha Shrine in Breath of the Wild. And Bottom of the Well is required to complete the game, but it still manages to completely fall short of an optional shrine. I could honestly spend hours just poring over shrines and shrine mechanics, but I've already done that in the puzzle section, so we'll move on to the rest of the dungeon analysis. In reality, the reason the Divine Beasts don't have a clear beginning, middle, and end is because every single one of them has a whole narrative subplot and separate puzzle battle designed specifically for entering the dungeon. To get into Vah Ruta, you have to ride on Sidon's back and use shock arrows you've collected from Shatterback Point to disable it. To get into Vah Rudania, you have to use cannons stationed on a path leading to Death Mountain to fire Yunobo at the beast and drive him into the caldera of the volcano. To get into Vah Naboris, you have to ride sand seals with Riju, who creates a lightning free zone that protects you while you disable its legs. And to get into Vah Meadow, you fly on Tebba's back to fire bomb arrows at the shield points, protecting it from being boarded. You're not just entering a dungeon, you're fighting a giant mechanical construct, and the first half of every one of these battles is figuring out a way in. The second half is the puzzles and interactivity required to take it down from the inside. I personally feel like that's a more interesting conceit than any of the aesthetics applied to the dungeons in Ocarina. A linear aesthetic experience really can't compare to a narrative cinematic component blended with emergent puzzle mechanics. So what does that mean? Does that mean the dungeon design in Ocarina is bad? Well, no, but it is linear. You can sum up every dungeon by saying start the dungeon, go through rooms until you find the dungeon item, use the dungeon item to clear the remaining rooms, then use it to fight the boss. That's not all that different from summing up the Divine Beasts by saying start the dungeon, find the main unit that activates the dungeon gimmick, activate the 5 pillars by using the dungeon gimmick, then go defeat the boss. I think when we break them down to their core components like this, neither of them sounds all that interesting, but I personally feel, and we're getting out of the objective and into the subjective here, that the active component of the Divine Beasts is significantly more important in determining their worth than the overall aesthetic feel of the dungeon itself. You can change the dungeon whenever you want. You can actively shape and control the way that the dungeon functions. You aren't a passive observer waiting to come into contact with the parts of the dungeon that allow you to interact with them, like children wandering around looking for a jungle gym to play on. You can move the entire room whenever your progress gets blocked, allowing you to become an active participant in shaping your own progress. It's like the difference between going to the park and going to an escape room. One of them has a neat little slide specifically built for kids to play on, and the other one is a wholly contained experience with its own rules and parameters. It's a whole different ballpark. In my opinion, there's actually a game that took what Breath of the Wild built and created a whole system just like it with the aesthetic purpose that everyone said it was missing: Tears of the Kingdom. The Lost Stormwind Arc, the Great Wellspring, Gorondia in the Underground, the Desert Pyramid, and the Construct Factory, the Wind, Water, Fire, Lightning, and Spirit Temples, took the idea of an active component and, instead of making it a menu item, turned it into a companion who follows you throughout the dungeon. While I don't fully agree with a return to static dungeon locations instead of incredibly cool mecha infiltration missions, I'm mixed on escort missions in general. These characters are quite helpful in a fight, and their powers are really good, but I personally felt like I was always doing a slightly different solution to puzzles than whatever was intended. That being said, the construct section in the second half of the Spirit Temple is one of the most fun things I've ever played in a Zelda game, and it's worth noting that they took a lot of inspiration from people's main complaint about Breath of the Wild. That Breath of the Wild's dungeons weren't enough like the old kinds of Zelda dungeons featured in most of the mainline series up until Breath of the Wild's release. Ultimately, regardless of what I have to say about the Divine Beasts, the haters won. Nintendo decided a return to form was a better idea than expanding on the cool mecha idea they had already built. So, that's where we're at. On puzzles and dungeons, I think Breath of the Wild stands head and shoulders above Ocarina, but it's really important to note that the complaints about these dungeons are what led to the synthesis of both dungeon designs in Tears of the Kingdom. Combat. The core of the combat in Ocarina of Time is structured around Z targeting. In order to make the jump from 2D to 3D as seamless as possible, the developers realized that because there was now a camera system, they needed to have some way for the player to focus on the specific enemy they were fighting without getting distracted by other enemies in the field or obstacles set around the area. There's a now decade-old critique of Ocarina of Time by Egoraptor, Aaron Hansen of Game Grumps, where he breaks down exactly what combat is in this game: lots and lots of waiting.
There is so much goddamn waiting. In Ocarina, every enemy has a period where they just stand around and do fucking nothing, and attacking them during this time is useless.
You can't easily damage most enemies. Stalfos will block all your attacks, Lizalfos will jump behind you, Skulltulas are immune to weapons from the front and turn around after a second, Shellblades are only vulnerable after they move towards you, Octoroks hide in between shooting projectiles at you. It's the way it works with almost every enemy in the game. You have to wait for an iron knuckle to finish swinging in between attacks or it'll knock you backwards. You have to wait for a Poe or a lever to be visible and out of the ground before you can strike it. Gerudo Thieves and Wolfos can block attacks, Bubbles are invulnerable until they drop their fire shield, and Redead and Gibdos freeze you on sight. A lot of people in the years since have given Aaron a lot of shit for being wrong in his critique, but I'm sorry, he ate with this one. The vast majority of enemies in this game are designed around the idea of waiting for an opening before you strike, which also applies to every single boss and mid-boss in the game. I will make a pretty important addendum here. The combat controls are deceptively simple, having a lot of options that were mentioned in the controls section. You can horizontal and vertical slash, crouch, stab, spin attack, quick spin attack, and jump attack, which is a lot of options for you to have to deal with enemies when there's no actual need to use anything beyond the first two. In addition, the Megaton Hammer can be used in place of a sword, but its uses are pretty limited. The bow, slingshot, boomerang, and hookshot are useful in combat, especially while Z targeting. But again, their uses are limited to things like strafing around Baronade with the boomerang to separate it from the ceiling, or shooting Bongo Bongo with the bow while bouncing above the drum. Outside of edge cases, your sword ends up being enough to take care of almost every enemy in the game. Now, obviously, Breath of the Wild has more options, but it's a little deeper than that. There are 9 weapon types and 3 bow types with 6 ammo types, and while you're not required to use more than one of each weapon, bow, and ammo, your options completely change how fights go. But the most important difference between Ocarina and Breath of the Wild is the camera controls. You are no longer limited to what's directly in front of you on the screen. The most complicated fight in all of Ocarina is probably the one where you fight 2 iron knuckles at one time, or maybe the one at the end of the ice cavern where you fight 2 white wolfos. Fights in Breath of the Wild can have like 10 bokoblins and a moblin on screen all at the same time. There can be some off screen trying to throw explosive barrels at you, or throwing rocks, or shooting arrows. The majority of the time you run into a group of bokoblins, there's a minimum of 3 enemies, and stall and keese enemies usually show up randomly at night in groups of 3 or 4. Just like in Ocarina, there are lots of enemies that are the sole focus of fights, but there's no waiting period between sections where you avoid attacks and deal damage, unless you're fighting something like a Lionel, which is a significantly harder enemy that has the power to break through your defenses. In addition to all this, enemies are frequently near explosive barrels or standing near cliff sides where they can be knocked back. You can use stasis to manipulate objects in your environment and send them flying at your enemies. You can sneak up on enemies and use Sneak Strike to instantly defeat them, or you can use masks to blend in with them and take them by surprise. The sheer number of options available to you in Breath of the Wild is significantly greater than Ocarina, and it shows. It's also really important for us to talk about the durability mechanic. Love it or hate it, I'm sure almost everyone hates it. Durability actually adds a component to battles that makes them way more stressful and unique. You can judge a battle from a distance. There's just a few too many bokoblins on that platform for me to take care of, or I don't have enough arrows to take out a Hinox, or I'll need an extra shield or 2 in order to block the Lionel's attacks because I'm bad at timing the perfect dodge. That's not me, by the way, I land every perfect dodge. But the point is, you have the ability to enter fights based on your overall preparation, and fights themselves usually provide gear that can partially replace what you use in battle. It provides depth to the combat that's not present in previous iterations of the franchise, and I've personally grown to appreciate what it does to make the whole system more interesting. The biggest problem is that Breath of the Wild doesn't have very many enemies in it. I personally believe it has significantly more interesting enemies, but it does have very few. There's only really 40 enemies excluding bosses, many of which have different color versions that represent different strength levels over the course of the game, depending on your relative progress. If you include the 55 or so enemies I consider to be copies of other enemies, there would technically be 100 on the dot, but I honestly think that's disingenuous. Comparatively, there's technically 92 in Ocarina of Time, but only 72 without bosses and mid-bosses, and additionally, if you don't count any duplicates like all the differently named Poes or the different colors of bubbles, that drops down to 52. And if you don't count any of the hazards that are listed as enemies in dungeons, that number drops down to 36. The big drawback, of course, is that almost all of these enemies are designed with that same wait for your chance to strike approach, instead of just being enemies out in the wild that you can deal with. Verdict: Breath of the Wild combat has more depth, and while both games employ a significant amount of copying and pasting in different ways, Ocarina's options for dealing with enemies is far more limited. Boss and mini-boss design. So, let's start with mini-bosses. One of the big problems in Breath of the Wild is that there aren't really any mini-bosses. 26 Guardian Stalkers, 40 Hinoxes, 40 Taluses, 22 Lynels, and 4 Moldugas technically fit the bill. But while they're certainly strong enemies, they're not really mini by any definition of the word, and there's 132 of them altogether. There's no midway point halfway through each Divine Beast where you battle them in separate bespoke arenas. What separates bosses from mini-bosses? What criteria can we use to definitively say that the core components of these enemies you fight out in the wild are substantially different from the enemies you fight at the end of the Divine Beast dungeons? In addition, since we have the option to fight them so often, don't they technically qualify as regular enemies? Part of the problem becomes that our definition of mini-boss is different from game to game. In Ocarina of Time, there are 38 mini-bosses in the game, but a mini-boss is defined, by the wiki at least, as any large enemy that isn't the final full boss of the dungeon that appears somewhere in the dungeon. So the wiki defines things like Lizalfos, Stalfos, White Wolfos, Gerudo Thieves, Iron Knuckles, and Meg the Poe as mini or middle bosses. The thing is, most of these really are just regular enemies. Stalfos Knights get featured as enemies in 9 separate dungeons, Lizalfos get featured in 6, while their slightly stronger counterpart, the Dinolfos, get featured in 2. White Wolfos appear twice as well, but their weaker counterpart, Wolfos, which are not considered sub-bosses despite being virtually the same as White Wolfos, are featured in 4. Dead Hand appears in 3 different dungeons, Gerudo Thieves are totally unique enemies, but you have to fight 4 of them in the Gerudo Fortress, Flare Dancers are totally unique enemies, but you fight 2 of them in the Fire Temple, and finally, the Iron Knuckle is featured 2 times in the Spirit Temple, and then once more for story reasons towards the end of the dungeon, and then 2 of them are featured as one of the last major enemies you fight before confronting Ganondorf. The only 3 middle bosses to not be repeated are Big Octo in Jabu Jabu's Belly, Meg the Poe in the Forest Temple, and Dark Link in the Water Temple. If we really try to compare the mid-bosses with the big spectacular landscape enemies of Breath of the Wild, we can come to the conclusion that the big enemies are better because, well, it wasn't really possible to have a lot of big enemies in Ocarina. Hinoxes, Taluses, and Moldugas are at least as big as King Dodongo or Bongo Bongo, if not significantly larger, and they have the ability to move independently around the landscape instead of being stuck in fixed movement patterns. In reality, the reason these enemies are so much more special is because there are so many resource mechanics built into the game. It's possible to come across an Igneo Talus and be virtually incapable of defeating it because you don't have ice arrows. Likewise, even towards the later stages of the game, it's possible to stumble on a Silver Lynel and, assuming you've recently fought something equally as strong, like a Stalnox or a Guardian Stalker, not have the requisite number of weapons to defeat it. You have to scale up in power, collect resources, and steel yourself before you can take on these challenges of these large imposing enemies. By comparison, the middle bosses in Ocarina require a little bit of skill to defeat, at least in recognizing their attack patterns, but they all have to be defeated with the Kokiri or Master Sword, and most of these enemies have a health total of around 10 to 12, which means 5 or 6 sword slashes to defeat them. Even the hardest bosses, Iron Knuckles and Dark Link, would end up requiring about 16 hits maximum before they go down. In the best case scenario, when using Begoron's sword, that drops to 8 slashes. Let's just use one example for Breath of the Wild. Guardian Stalkers have 1500 HP. The weapons have 2 important numbers, which is their durability and their damage. Their durability usually drops by 1 point every time you land a hit, and the exact amount of damage dealt on each hit is listed in your inventory. So if you have 2 Royal Broadswords, weapons with 36 damage and 36 durability, you can deal a combined total of 1332 damage with the weapon, including the double damage hit that happens when it breaks. But if you're playing near the beginning of the game, your strongest weapon is probably going to be a soldier's broadsword, a weapon with 14 damage and 25 durability. Multiply the numbers, add 1 extra hit's worth of damage, and you get 375. Your best case scenario is that you'll burn through both your broadswords and be stuck with whatever else you've got, and if you're only 8 hours into the game, that might amount to a handful of weapons. Boko bows, boko clubs, tree branches, rusty broadswords, rusty claymores, whose collective damage total adds up to either far less than 100 per weapon or just over 100. It's not just that there's math you have to start doing in your head, it's that you have to weigh your options and commit when fighting bigger enemies. You can rely on player skill to compensate for the low damage, but that only gets you so far. In addition to all this, every one of these bosses has a weak spot that you exploit to deal damage. The rocks on the back of Taluses, the Hinox's eye, the Molduga eating bombs, reflecting the Stalker's lasers, and flurry rushing or mounting the Lynel while it is stunned. Now, honestly, I don't have anywhere near as much to say about the bosses. I think that despite how memorable and well designed the bosses in Ocarina all are from an artistic standpoint, they're not very clever from a game design standpoint, and this is a testament to its design as a Zelda game. The fact that these bosses are the way they are is a holdover from 2D Zelda. Did you reach the end of a dungeon and collect an item in the last 45 minutes of gameplay? You'll never believe what you're about to use it to do. Goma Slingshot, King Dodongo Bombs, Baronade Boomerang, Phantom Ganon Bow, Volvagia Hammer, Morpha Longshot, Bongo Bongo Hover Boots, Twinrova Mirror Shield, done. And I know what a lot of people are gonna say, you just criticized big glowing weak points on Ocarina's bosses without criticizing them on Breath of the Wild's landscape enemies. To which I would say, yeah, we should have higher expectations for the bosses, and that almost everyone has something negative to say about Breath of the Wild's Ganon Blights at the end of each Divine Beast dungeon. A lot of people have criticized the Blight bosses in Breath of the Wild for being too similar, but I would say that they're much closer in design to the bosses in later Zelda games by virtue of having a clearly defined first and second half, in which they attempt to change their attack pattern to confuse the player. From a gameplay perspective, the Water Blight and Thunder Blight fights are actually very interesting and rather difficult. The Fire Blight and Wind Blight fights are not as difficult, mostly because you stun the former with bombs, making the fight rather easy, and you fight the latter predominantly with bullet time while paragliding, which makes the fight trivial. It's interesting to note that they actually scale in difficulty. The first Blight you battle has 800 HP, and each successive Blight gains 400 from that starting point until reaching a maximum of 2000. When taken in the aggregate, it's hard not to say these bosses are better designed because combat is better designed. The relative strength and durability of your weaponry, the reserve cache of ammunition you prepare, and your use of combat-specific skills all contributes to your success. But there's definitely a lack of aesthetic purpose beyond these being corrupted constructs, and I do feel the need to point out that Nintendo very clearly heard these critiques and intentionally avoided repeating this problem in Tears of the Kingdom. Marbled Goma, Colgera, Muktarok, Queen Gibdo, the Seized Construct, and especially that Ganondorf fight with the enormous health bar. And I would definitely say that despite the fact that Breath of the Wild's bosses are all aesthetically similar, all their fights are actually very memorable. Verdict? Even in the best case scenario, there's just not really anything like the bosses from Breath of the Wild and Ocarina. You use the item you're expected to use to make the boss vulnerable, you bop it with your weapon a few times, and you move on to the next one. The aesthetic distinction between the bosses really isn't enough to make up for their lack of complexity. Quests. Let's start off by asking what a quest is. In simple terms, a quest is any time a character tells you to go do something and you do it for a reward. You can use a bomb to stop the rolling Goron as adult Link in Goron City, and when you talk to him, he reveals his name is Link, that all the Gorons have been captured, and that he has a sweet, sweet Goron tunic that will protect you in the Fire Temple. You can use the blue fire you put in a bottle from the Ice Cavern on King Zora, and he'll give you a Zora tunic for rescuing him. There are lots of these little quests scattered all over future Hyrule, like rescuing Epona from Lon Lon Ranch after it gets taken over by Ingo by racing him in the horse racing minigame, or saving the 4 trapped construction workers from the Gerudo Fortress, both of which are required quests to complete the game. There just aren't very many side quests. There's getting through the timed Begoron trading sequence after completing the Ice Cavern, finding the Sun's Song, the 100 gold Skulltulas scattered throughout the game, selling the masks from the Happy Mask Shop, collecting all 6 of the Great Fairy rewards. There's also collecting all 36 heart pieces, which is less of a side quest and more of a collection game similar to the gold Skulltulas. Collecting the fire arrows and ice arrows each have little associated puzzles, The latter requires completing the Gerudo training grounds, and there's also lots of mini-games that give rewards that technically also qualify as side quests, like playing music for the frogs on the Zora River or mimicking the notes played by the Skull Kids in the Lost Woods. By my count, if we add up the total number of main quests and side quests in the game, we get 11 from dungeons, 6 sub-quests that are done in between dungeons as a part of the main plot, and 11 optional side quests for collecting all optional items, for a total of 28 quests in the entirety of Ocarina of Time. Comparatively, in Breath of the Wild, there are 76 side quests available in some way, shape, or form throughout the game, 30 of them locked by some combination of starting and/or completing main quests in their associated regions. This does not include the 42 shrine quests or the 15 main quests, which are labeled differently in the game's own quest journal. This adds up to a total of 133 quests in the game, not including DLC or expansion content. Verdict: the amount of content in Breath of the Wild is not only 4 times greater than its predecessor, but significantly more varied. Point for Breath of the Wild. Minigames. The quality of the minigames in Ocarina of Time is actually very good. Of the 12 total, there's fishing, kuko counting, horseback archery, bombchu bowling, horse racing, shooting galleries, slingshot and bow, the treasure chest game, the diving game, Skull Kid jam session, musical frogs, racing Dampé, and finally, Dampé's grave digging tour. There are slightly more mini-games in Breath of the Wild, clocking in at 16. The Birdman Research Study, Boom Bam Golf, Carry the Ice, Deer Hunting, the Flight Range, a Foot Race, the Gut Check Rock Challenge, Horseback Archery, an Obstacle Course, a Paraglider Course, Restoring the Blue Flame, a Sand Seal Race, Shield Surfing, Snowball Bowling, the Treasure Chest Game, and the 4 collective mini-challenges in the Test of Wood, which are counted as 1 for the purposes of this list. Really quick, we should define what a minigame actually is. Minigames are when there exists an established set of rules inside the game itself, which are different from the established rules of the greater game. In both video games, Link can ride a horse, but in the horseback archery minigames, Link must ride a horse while hitting a certain number of targets with his bow, the established parameters, in order to win a prize. From a literal perspective, Breath of the Wild having more minigames should mean it wins the point, but how are the minigames different? The simplest answer to this is to break down what each of the minigames is by the way the player has to interact with them. In other words, of the 11 minigames in Ocarina, 2 of them require access to Link's horse Epona, 1 shooting gallery requires the slingshot, another shooting gallery requires the bow, the frogs and the Skull Kids require the ocarina, and the remainder, 5 minigames, can be done by finding the minigame itself, rather than by having access to any specific items. In Breath of the Wild, Birdman Research Study requires scaling the Ridgeland Tower, Carry the Ice requires talking to some specific NPCs in sequence, Flight Range requires advancing part-way through the Divine Beast Va Meadow story quest, the Paraglider course requires clearing Korgu Chide Shrine, the Sand Seal Race requires completing Divine Beast Va Naboris, and the remaining 11 minigames can be completed by finding the minigame itself rather than by advancing through a specific set of quest requirements or NPC dialogues. So not only are there more games available in Breath of the Wild, but fewer of them are content locked behind story progress, though they are more spread out by virtue of the fact that the map is much larger. I don't know that there's any benefit to comparing the quality of these mini-games, because they are, by definition, miniature games. They're little side games built into the game to distract you from the core gameplay loop, and they are there to provide temporary relief. But the problem is that in Ocarina, these minigames are a requirement to collect a variety of upgrades related to Link's abilities. The diving game gives the silver scale, fishing gives the golden scale, bombchu bowling gives the bigger bomb bag, the shooting galleries give the bigger quiver and bigger Deku seed bag, horseback racing gives the biggest quiver, racing Dampé gives you the hookshot, and all the games combined give a collective total of 9 pieces of heart as rewards for completion. That's 6 non-required upgrades and 1 required upgrade collected from playing through minigames. In reality, this isn't that different from locking shrines behind the Test of Wood or the Gut Check Rock Challenge, or locking the Ancient Shop at the Akala Lab behind Restoring the Blue Flame. My big problem is that I just don't find any of the minigames fun. I don't like the minigames very much, I don't particularly care to get good at any of the challenging ones in Breath of the Wild, and the ones in Ocarina are so easy that you can bowl over them without much trouble. That's basically the only reason I would give the point to Breath of the Wild. It's not as if there's a reason to shoot for a high score, but getting a high score can actually be pretty difficult from game to game, which just isn't the case in Ocarina, so I think it makes a better experience. Verdict: I think it is a fair criticism to say that Breath of the Wild not having a fishing pole is one of the biggest oversights the game actually made with regards to its minigames. But even noting this, my consensus is still that the point goes to Breath of the Wild for the number of games, the variety of access, and the overall challenge provided to the player. Story. Written dialogue. I'm not going to go too deep into the written dialogue between the two games because, to be perfectly honest with you, I'm tired and the script is already very, very long. But that being said, there are some important points of order we can make about both games. The written dialogue in Ocarina of Time is actually very, very good for a Nintendo 64 game. It's not the most stellar writing in the world, but it is roughly the quality of any standard JRPG released in 1998. When we actually break down which characters talk in Ocarina of Time, there are 75 unique characters that have a name or a place in the world, including everyone from Great Fairies and Skull Kids to the Kokiri, Mido, and Fado to the Six Sages, in addition to a number of generic characters who also have a line or two of throwaway dialogue. There are, by my count, 422 named characters in Breath of the Wild, not including any generic unnamed characters that might have dialogue. A significant chunk of these characters are included in side quests or have some kind of additional dialogue content based on what amount of the game you've completed or what side quests you've embarked upon. And here's one of the most interesting things. Both games actually have a text dump available online. The text dump of Ocarina of Time has been available on GameFAQs since 2002, and I found and downloaded a TXT copy of the text dump from Breath of the Wild from a Tumblr user. The thing that's really interesting about text dumps isn't that we can simply read and compare dialogue, but that we can do some really, really funny stuff with it. Like, for example, there are 2,596 recorded instances of exclamation points in Ocarina of Time, and there are only 733 question marks. You can find this out by just using Control F in the text dump, and by comparison, there are 13,302 exclamation points and 7,640 question marks in Breath of the Wild. That means there are more than 4 times as many exclamatory statements and over 10 times as many interrogatives. You can even get interesting information just by comparing file sizes. Ocarina's text dump takes up about 227 kilobytes of data in plain text, while Breath of the Wild's takes up 2.3 megabytes. Meaning that there's almost exactly 10 times as much plain text featured in the game as there is in Ocarina. Now, being a text dump, that doesn't mean all of that information is written dialogue. A significant chunk of that is menu dialogue, or item descriptions, or things that fall outside the purview of characters talking. That being said, this applies to both games, so the judgment that there's probably between 8 and 10 times as much written dialogue is probably not an unfair assessment. And to get to the actual content of the written dialogue itself, the dialogue is fine. It's fine. There's not really any difference between the two games' dialogue, all things considered. They serve the same purpose, whether you're reading a throwaway line some NPC has to say about another NPC, or a reminder from a plot-relevant character to go do whatever plot-relevant action you're supposed to complete next. The sensibilities in Breath of the Wild are just a bit more modern. You have people working on games today whose actual writing skill puts them on par with the average novelist, and I know that because I worked with lots of people in games development who wrote their own novels, myself included. Writing is a job, and you take it where you can get it. It's no secret that back in 1998, those kinds of writing gigs didn't really exist for games the way they do today. A narrative department or story writing team looked a lot smaller than it does in modern studios. Even noting that neither game has the words narrative or writer or story listed anywhere in their credits. With one exception, there's an English text writer listed for Ocarina of Time with 1 English translator, 1 script supervisor, and 1 script director. Breath of the Wild only has the 1 script supervisor and nearly a few dozen people from Nintendo of America who did localization, which makes me wonder who actually wrote all the dialogue for the game. It's not entirely clear to me who would have been given that job beyond maybe the people credited as game designers, but I can't be totally sure by reading the credits, and it's very different from what we consider to be the writing staff in Western game development. All that being said, I think Breath of the Wild wins by default just by virtue of having modern dialogue over what we used to consider dialogue that was good enough. Overarching plot. I'm gonna tip my hat towards something a little more subjective because I worked as a professional writer for 5 years. I'd like to compare the plot of both games and judge which one is better using my expertise as a writer. To prep for this video, I watched a years-old review where someone had compared the story of Ocarina of Time to the story of Breath of the Wild, and their conclusion included 2 important points. One, that because the story was disconnected and disjointed and told in so many different bits and pieces, that it added up to a less cohesive whole than its predecessor, and 2, that because the main characters of the story were dead 100-year-old spirits who could not grow as characters, that the game had failed to have characters who grow and change with the plot the way Ocarina did. I will respond to these in tandem. Point 1. The reason Breath of the Wild's story is disjointed is because almost 0% of people who saw that this was an open world game just followed whatever the quest markers told them to do. I'm sure there were plenty of people who, after the tutorial, gladly went along the road and followed the quest marker for Kakariko to go talk to Impa before doing anything else. I'm not saying those people were playing the game wrong. In fact, from a plot perspective, they played the game correctly. But almost everyone I knew refused to do the story quests and intentionally went off the beaten path because it seemed like the fun thing to do. The thing is, when you're off the beaten path, you're not actually getting the emotional catharsis of the storyline because every cutscene is divided by multiple hours of fucking around in the wilderness. And it's not even that this represents an incorrect way to play the game, but it's important to note, if we're going to criticize how well put together the story is, we need to actually play through the game through its core gameplay loop the way it was intended to be played. Get out of the tutorial, go straight to Kakariko, learn about the Divine Beasts and the Memory Quest, head on out for the first Divine Beast, maybe do 1 or 2 of the memories along the way, collect a few shrines along the road, rinse repeat until all 4 of the beasts are beaten. Then head for the Lost Woods, ideally by this point you have enough life to take out the Master Sword, grab it and head for the final confrontation. I guarantee if you play it that way, it'll be perfectly put together in a way that won't feel incredibly disjointed and disconnected, but instead feel like one consistent, cohesive storyline. That being said, it will be split up by hours and hours of moving across the landscape because Breath of the Wild's world is enormous and traversing it takes time. Point 2, I don't think this person knows what character development is. For starters, there really aren't any characters who develop throughout the entirety of Ocarina of Time. No one has an opinion that changes over the course of the story. Every character is static, they have their beliefs at the start of their journeys and have roughly the same beliefs at the end of their journey. Even Saria, Darunia, Rudo, Impa, and Zelda, the 5 characters who get seen at both the beginning and end of the game, don't really develop so much as they just gain the ability to do one extra thing, which is use their sage abilities to help Link. Zelda actually is the exception, and is probably the only character with any development, mostly through her decision to attempt to deceive the player as Sheik and her knowledge of Sheikah techniques. But the problem is that she turns back into Princess Zelda to use her powers exclusively to help Link, and then immediately gets kidnapped. She doesn't get to use any of those powers she developed throughout the plot in the final battle, she just uses the powers she's had since the beginning, which is, from my perspective, a real downer. Compare and contrast this with Breath of the Wild, where Teba is attempting to take on Va Meadow by himself, but recognizes Link's skill and joins with him in the fight against the Divine Beast. Or Yunobo, who's clearly a scaredy cat. He's constantly afraid of using his power to fight or help people, but Link comes along and helps him find the confidence he needs to stand up. There's definitely a lack of character development in this game where there could have been a lot, but it's virtually non-existent in Ocarina outside of one character. It's especially important to note that 5 of the most important figures in the game are spirits whose sole purpose is to guide Link to their descendants so he can join with them in the fight against the Divine Beasts, allowing them to fulfill their purpose as the Centennial Champions of yesteryear. Do those characters need to evolve past what their purpose is? Do they need to have some kind of special development that makes them learn or grow as individuals when they plan to disappear after the events of the game? Even if the answer to both of those questions was yes, they had you covered. You learn their backstory through the Memories side quest and get to watch how they all interact with each other and Link and Zelda. That is development. You watch characters grow over a period of time, and even though they're gone now, you get a feeling of who they are and what's important to them and how they eventually changed. Just like Himmel the Hero. Now, could Ocarina's plot have been better? Yes. Did Breath of the Wild actually manage to write a better plot? Definitely. Are both games still kind of mediocre from a plot perspective? You better believe it. Isn't it unfortunate that they rehash most of the same tropes that have existed in the Zelda series since the Super Nintendo days? Absolutely. And I'd still take it over Ocarina's any day of the week because, in case you weren't aware, with the exception of the final cutscene, the Ocarina of Time does not actually get used to travel through time at any point in the video game titled Ocarina of Time. Link does not gain the ability to use the Song of Time to travel backwards in time until Majora's Mask. In fact, when Zelda plays the Ocarina of Time to send Link back into the past and regain his lost years, she doesn't even play the Song of Time, she plays Zelda's fucking lullaby. But he can use the Ocarina to make time blocks appear and disappear, which also is not actually a time-based mechanic because it doesn't like cause a block to appear in the time you're currently not in. It just materializes a block where you're standing. And this might sound pithy, but I actually feel like I'm getting a Breath of the Wild. I don't understand what the fuck my Ocarina of Time is doing if it's not letting me time travel. Open world versus linearity. We're going to switch gears for our final topic, which I divorced from the gameplay section on purpose so we could have a little more objective analysis right at the end. We're going to really get into the weeds and talk about open world games versus linearity. There's a lot of consternation about the real definition of what an open world game is, and in the strictest sense, an open world game is just one where you can go wherever the hell you want. And in Ocarina of Time, you definitely meet the base criteria. You have in front of you an open landscape which you must traverse in order to get to a destination somewhere on the landscape, usually of your choosing. But the real problem is that last little bit in the formula. You don't really have options in Ocarina of Time, at least not according to the core gameplay loop of the game. You have the option to head to the Gerudo Valley as a child, but you're stopped at the bridge by a Gerudo woman who forces you to turn back. You have the option to go up to the mouth of Zora's River, but you'll be blocked at the Sleepless Waterfall until you have access to Zelda's Lullaby. You have the option to enter Kakariko Village, but if you attempt to head up to Death Mountain, you'll be stopped by the guard at the gate who refuses to open it without a letter from Princess Zelda. In reality, the linear nature of the game's plot belies the open world you're faced with when you first exit the Kokiri Forest. You're required to do things in a certain sequence to unlock any progress in the game, including getting access to almost every available side quest throughout the entirety of the game's plot. In Breath of the Wild, however, after the tutorial, you can go anywhere you want. Literally, pick any direction and start walking. Very little is actually progress locked, and the majority of content that you choose to do is almost entirely reliant on players' skill rather than accumulated upgrades or story progress. That's not to say there aren't exceptions, like everything regarding the story quests and the Divine Beasts, but if you want to ignore the main story quests and complete all 120 shrines, climb all the towers, unlock all the great fairies, get every Korok seed, and take pictures of as many of the creatures, monsters, materials, equipment, and treasure as you possibly can, you can go right ahead and do it. Though admittedly, to complete the compendium, you do have to take pictures of the Blight bosses and Dark Beast Ganon himself. Either way, the world is your oyster. This is the definition of the open world. You choose where you go, and the game doesn't railroad you back into taking the path most traveled. In fact, if you want to go straight to the final boss, you have the option to fly yourself into Hyrule Castle and take on Ganon himself. It's gonna be hard, but players have done it. That's why the speedrun for this game lasts, what, 23 minutes? Regional analysis. But hey, let's say someone's not convinced. Open world means open world, and being able to travel across a landscape means that's that. What else could we do to show them that they're wrong? Well, we could start by breaking the game up into its constituent zones and detailing all the content that's available in it with a regional analysis. First, we need to break down how many regions there are. If we look at the Kokiri Forest, Hyrule Field, Death Mountain, Zora's Domain, Lake Hylia, and Gerudo Valley, we come up with 6 distinct mega-regions in Ocarina of Time that comprise almost all of the game's content. Every dungeon, every town, every feature within the game falls into one of these zones. Thankfully, we don't have to make up our own definitions for Breath of the Wild because the game is already divided into 8 mega-regions. Akkala, Central Hyrule, Eldin, Faran, Gerudo, Hebra, Lanayru, and Necluda. In addition to these 8 mega-regions, the game's areas can be further divided into 15 map sections that are revealed when you scale the 15 Sheikah Towers. Akkala, Central, Dueling Peaks, Eldin, Faran, Gerudo, Great Plateau, Hateno, Hebra, Lake, Lanayru, Ridgeland, Tabantha, Wasteland, and Woodland. If we look at towns as an example, there are 6 of them in Ocarina of Time. The Kokiri Forest, Hyrule Castle Town, Kakariko Village, Goron City, Zora's Domain, and Gerudo's Fortress. In Breath of the Wild, there are 10 settlements: Gerudo Town, Goron City, Hateno Village, Kakariko Village, the Karakara Bazaar, Korok Forest, Lurelin Village, Rito Village, Tari Town, and Zora's Domain. In addition, there are 15 stables, 1 to 2 per region, that average at least a few named NPCs each, giving us 25 total settlements in Breath of the Wild. By comparing dungeons, we already know there's Ocarina's 12 to Breath of the Wild's 4, but Breath of the Wild compensates for this by adding 120 shrines across the landscape. Throughout Ocarina, there are 33 secret grottos that can be accessed in the regions you visit. The only problem is that 25 of these 33 grottos are progress locked, and can only be accessed through the usage of bombs, the Song of Storms, the Megaton Hammer, and the Silver Gauntlets. If you look at all the checks available in Ocarina of Time, there are 273 places where items can be acquired by Link. This includes everything: characters rewarding you with items or rupees, heart pieces and other items sitting visibly on the ground, bosses rewarding you with heart containers, etc. Of this number, 175 of them are chests, only 32 of which appear outside dungeons. Compare and contrast this with Breath of the Wild, which has over 1,300 chests split between its locations, in addition to quest rewards from NPCs, story events, and bosses. As detailed in the combat section, if we count the total number of unique enemies in each game, we arrive at roughly 36 for Ocarina of Time and 40 for Breath of the Wild. Upon closer inspection, only 22 of Ocarina's 36 enemy types appear outside of dungeons, 15 of which are exclusive to one zone, e.g. Stall Children, Big Pose, and Peahats in Hyrule Field, or Moblins in the Sacred Forest Meadow. Breath of the Wild's 40 enemies are available almost unilaterally in every zone, with some exceptions. The Molduga is exclusive to the desert, different classes of Octoroks appear in different climates, and Igneo and Frost Taluses and Peblets are exclusive to Death Mountain and Hebra, respectively. As detailed in the written dialogue section, there are about 75 named characters in Ocarina of Time, and 422 named characters in Breath of the Wild. As detailed in the quest section, there are about 28 quests in Ocarina of Time, and 133 quests in Breath of the Wild. As detailed in the items and character abilities section, there are 53 items in Ocarina of Time, and 586 in Breath of the Wild. As detailed in the puzzles section, Ocarina only really has 8 different types of puzzle mechanics, while Breath of the Wild has 66 unique shrine puzzles in addition to the totally bespoke puzzles designed in the Divine Beast dungeons. There are also 16 different classifications of Korok seeds. So let's just look at the facts. What does each region in Ocarina of Time actually give us? For the purposes of this list, I rounded most of the averages to the nearest whole number, with the exception of Breath of the Wild's dungeon counter. When we average out what there is to do in the 6 typical mega regions of Ocarina of Time, there's roughly 2 dungeons, 1 town, 6 grottos, 9 unique items, 30 chests, 13 named NPCs, 5 quests, and about 4 unique enemy types that appear outside of dungeons, or 6 unique enemy types when you include the dungeons themselves. When we average out what there is to do in the 8 typical mega regions of Breath of the Wild, there's roughly 0.5 dungeons, 3 towns, 73 unique items, 162 treasure chests, 53 named NPCs, 17 quests, 15 shrines, 113 Korok seeds, and roughly 30 different enemy types that appear in every region, with about 10 or so enemies being region-specific. To make a more fair assessment, since mega regions are actually enormous in Breath of the Wild, we can parcel it back down into the 15 map sections, which cuts most of these numbers in half. For every map section in Breath of the Wild, there's 0.3 dungeons, 1.6 towns, 39 unique items, 87 treasure chests, 9 quests, 28 named NPCs, 8 shrines, 60 Korok seeds, but roughly 30 different enemy types that are not limited by region. This is really what Breath of the Wild breaks down to. Almost 3 times as many towns, 3 times as many quests, 5 times as many treasures, 5 times as many NPCs, 5 times as many enemy types while you're exploring, and to top it off, nearly 10 mini-dungeons and dozens of micro-puzzles scattered around the landscape for you to find. Even including the items in this list is almost unfair. The vast majority of items in the game aren't actually region-locked, so you can collect hundreds of the items available in the game wherever you end up going. What our regional analysis tells us is that Ocarina of Time's narrative and gameplay structure was largely based around overcoming the obstacles in the story so you could overcome the obstacles in the dungeons. It was about slowly developing your toolkit on an area-by-area basis, steadily increasing your abilities to complete the puzzles put in front of you. But Breath of the Wild has a totally different vibe. That's not to say it's not about building and developing your character, but it doesn't force you to choose. It provides you with a variety of options and places to interact with that can empower you to take an active role in affecting the landscape around you. If you go through the Faron region, complete half the Korok seeds, all the shrines, and a handful of the quests, you don't have to stay and finish them to unlock your potential in other areas. You can just move on to the next zone and play around in that one instead. Breath of the Wild's one caveat is that the enormous story dungeons that loom over the landscapes of 4 of the distinct mega regions in the game clock in at a lower number than the dungeons that are ensconced within the mega regions of Ocarina of Time. To compensate, there's 15 shrines per zone, many of which have their own dedicated puzzles on the overworld instead of having puzzles exclusively baked into the fabric of the miniature dungeon themselves. When we compare it to the overworld in Ocarina of Time, we find that there are barely any actual puzzles outside of the confines of the dungeons. Honestly, that seems like it should be a requirement for calling any game open world, to actually have more than a very small handful of puzzles in its overworld map. Verdict: while both games are technically open world, calling Ocarina of Time an open world game makes no sense considering the modern definition of the term. Breath of the Wild gets a point. Conclusion. Look, if after watching this video you're still convinced that Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever made, more power to you. But the fact of the matter is that the metrics we used to judge video games in the 90s weren't actually all that different from the metrics we use to judge video games today. We look at the graphics, the controls, the gameplay, the story, and we make an assessment based on what it does. But it's not really fair to compare a system whose maximum graphical output is 240p with a system that can output in 1080 without acknowledging how good that was for the time. It's not really fair to compare the N64 controller to the Switch controller, which is just functionally better by virtue of having a second control stick for the camera. It's not really fair to insist that the written dialogue, which is functionally just as ancillary to the plot of Breath of the Wild as it was to Ocarina, has less modern sensibilities that make it sound a little more stilted and uninteresting to read through. It's barely fair at all to compare the dungeons between the two games, but because the complaints about the Divine Beasts were so profound, Tears of the Kingdom had a return to form. Despite all this, the only category you could definitively say Ocarina of Time is better in is its dungeon design, and I feel like you would have to refuse to acknowledge shrines at all to make that argument. When we actually break down the differences between the two games, we find that Nintendo delivered a Zelda experience that was different than what we were used to, while still signaling almost all the things players cared about. But this time, the world was enormous, you could climb on every surface, and your admittedly limited options felt nearly limitless. You can objectively use more items than in Ocarina, go to more places than in Ocarina, do more things in the overworld than Ocarina, talk to more NPCs, find more treasure, do more quests, and solve more puzzles using a fully fledged physics engine that's more robust than any of the puzzles featured in its predecessor. If you've watched this video and you're not convinced that Breath of the Wild is an objectively better game than Ocarina of Time, and that it deserves to stand higher in the Metacritic user ratings, then I think you might seriously be nostalgia poisoned. You don't ever have to give up on Ocarina of Time, but everything has its place in history, and I think it's time to move on. Someday in the future, we'll have to move on from Breath of the Wild, too. It might be years before that happens, but I promise you that day is coming sooner than you think. I would like to give a shout out to the people who compiled text dumps for this video, as well as the authors of the Korok Seeds Guide on ZeldaDungeon.net. Really could not have done this without the tireless efforts of people who are in the fan community providing data on these games. You really are a pillar of support. Of course, I could not have made this video without a significant amount of content pulled from Longplays and YouTube videos, some of them literally uploaded 15 years ago. I am so thankful to everyone in the Zelda community who plays these games for the internet. You people are amazing. I have a public poll up on my Patreon for future videos in this series. If you liked this video, please understand that I am not currently monetized or making ad revenue, so I could really use your support on my Patreon. Check it out. This is the first in the series, but I've got at least 7 videos planned and like 2 of them fully scripted, so next video coming up pretty quick. Thank you all so much for watching.